So we're in our third lesson today on the book of Ecclesiastes. It looks like there'll end up being about 11 or 12 of these lessons when I kind of look down into the future and see how we're going to lay the rest of the book out. So this is the third lesson, and the second lesson that's basically covering what is the meaning of life through Solomon's trying to figure this out. You know, Solomon was a fortunate man where he was given by God a vast amount of wisdom. And because of what he asked for, God rewarded him with that wisdom. And then all of a sudden, next thing you know, he's benefiting in all kind of facets of his life, right? And he's an intelligent man. And so he comes to the conclusion, he says, all right, I got to really find out what is the meaning of life here. And he was fortunate enough to be able to kind of stratify different areas of life. And he says, you know, I'm going to test my wisdom, and I'm going to really go all in on this piece, on this piece, on this piece, searching for why am I here? And hopefully he can find out, okay, this makes sense. Then I can write it down and let everybody know, okay? And early on, we've talked about that with the introduction. We talked about it in chapter 1. And we're going to find out today in just a little bit that he has an epiphany in chapter 2. That for the first time in the book, he shares with us, the reader. And he's starting to figure some things out. And we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But a quick review, kind of talking about the introduction. We obviously know that in your line it refers to Solomon as the preacher. Often when we write our text here, we talk about the preacher. We know that Solomon, in the way that the original text of the book, if a direct translation is really called an assembler, not necessarily a preacher, although that's kind of my interpretation as a preacher, but an assembler is really how it translates through. And that assembler is what? Assembler of people to give information to. Henceforth, we call them the preacher of today. So that's kind of how that's laid out. We talked about how in chapter 1, how Solomon starts looking around for the meaning of life. And the first thing that he looks at is nature. And he starts seeing the cyclical part of nature, how the weather comes in a pattern and leaves in a pattern and repeats itself. And he talks about the rain and the rivers. And he says it's weird how all these rivers flow down to the ocean, but yet the ocean never does get full, right? And talks about the cyclical nature of rain. And so he starts using that to say, are we really living in a world where nothing really ever changes? The more things change, the more they actually stay the same. And so looking around and seeing nature, that's when he started thinking, I got to dig a little deeper. Am I just a rat on a wheel here? Am I on a treadmill? Is that what man's life is? Are we just looking to get through the next day so we can repeat the day before again? And so when you think about it from his speeches, this collection of speeches that we have for us today, that's really the impetus of what is the meaning of life. Is there really a meaning, or are we just in a cycle here? And then he went on to say in chapter 1, look at the technology advances of yesteryear in today. There's really no invention over time, because what happens is people just have forgotten over time what people did a long time ago. And we're just rediscovering ourselves all the time again. So anyway, that's what really got him started. Having godly wisdom in a vast amount, more than anybody else, allowed him, he knew this, so it allowed him to really take a hard look on human wisdom. So I've got godly wisdom that's going to guide me through this process. I want to take that wisdom and really do a down and deep study on human wisdom. Okay, and that's what he moved through in chapter 1 that we went through last week. A really hard evaluation on human wisdom to decide, does that really mean anything when you start looking at the global meaning of life. And so we went through some of that. And of course, we know that he came to the conclusion that human wisdom is simply grasping for the wind, he says, and vanity. He says that such wisdom actually was the source of much grief and sorrow. Human wisdom was the source of man's grief and sorrow. Now why? Well, he told us that. And that is because the more we look at the world and the more we look at what's happening, the more we really come to the conclusion there's not a lot, if anything, we can do to significantly change the world. So what happens? We end up getting information overload with something we can't do anything about. So we all of a sudden have this grief because we see all the things that need to change. We see all the things we want to do. But in the grand scheme of things, human wisdom has limitations to it and doesn't allow us to fulfill that. Once again, we're in the cyclical nature of the world. Therefore, he comes in and says that the source of human wisdom is much grief and sorrow. So now we come to chapter 2, which is today. He says, okay, I can't really make sense of that. So I'm going to continue with my studies, and I'm going to turn my attention on my efforts to explore the value of mirth, pleasure, wine, and folly. And I'm going to dig down deep into that. And I'm going to see if that is what I'm here for. Now, before we get started, those are some words that we don't use just a whole lot. Mirth, right? If you don't know what that means, that's okay. I had to look it up too. What does mirth mean? I won't ask you to raise your hand or anything like that, but I've got a definition. Gaiety or jollity, especially when accompanied by laughter. It's kind of interesting, right? Some similar terms: hilarity, laughter, levity, rejoicing, amusement, cheer, and cheerfulness. I like the word amusement, right? He's going to explore cheerfulness, having fun, joyfulness, amusement, to see if that's the meaning of life. Am I just here to have fun? Okay? And then, so he talks about another word here. He talks about pleasure. We know that. Wine, we know that. Folly. He's going to really take a deep dive into folly to try to see if that is going to be What does folly mean? That's not a word we use all the time either. Foolishness. A lot of your scriptures will talk about foolishness. So I have a definition for that too. A lack of good sense. A lack of normal prudence and foresight. Foolishness. But I want to submit to you that there's also another definition that I think plays into this account of Solomon. Okay? If you look a little deeper, there's also a definition of folly. And it is a costly ornamental building with no practical purpose. All right, now what does that have to do with anything? A costly ornamental building with no practical purpose. And I got to thinking about that, and it jumped into my mind. I hadn't even told Kimberly about this. Kimberly and I were at it's been a couple of years ago, we were at a nursery, not a kid nursery, but a plant nursery. And we were walking through, looking at all the flowers, trying to figure out what would look good in our space. And we looked up, and in the middle of their garden, I saw this structure. And I looked up, and I'm like, what is that? And it looked like a little playhouse, a little Gothic playhouse, or like a little, 14th century castle sitting over there. And I said, the person that was helping, I said, what is that? And they said, that's a folly house. And of course, I didn't know what a folly. I didn't want to act like I I didn't want to ask it questions. So I'm like, oh, yeah. So Kimberly and I said, did you see that? She goes, yeah, let's walk over there and see what that is. I said, man, that's probably pretty cool on the inside. So we walk up to this folly house to determine what? It's just a facade. This grand structure that looks so cool, it has no inside, right? It's only the appearance on the outside, and it's solid, like solid rock or solid. So it's just the outside. Somebody spent a lot of money making something that looked really nice that has absolutely no purpose. So now what do you mean talking about Solomon here? What was Solomon known for? Built big things, right? He was a master builder. And so I submit to you, not only talking about foolishness and folly, but he also pursued in his building these structures that had no purpose because it made him feel good. Was that going to be part of the reason why he's on the earth? Okay? So just a little something to think about on that. So let's get into chapter 2. So the preacher decides to start testing life again. And he finds out it doesn't take any time. Look at verses 1 and verses 2. And I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with mirth. We talked about that. Therefore enjoy pleasure. But surely this was also vanity. I said of laughter, madness, and of mirth, what does it accomplish? He knew real quick. It didn't take him long to study that mirth, madness, laughter, cheerfulness, that's not the reason why people are here. There's something deeper for the meaning of life. And he describes what he did, that he experimented with wine and folly. He had all this wisdom, and he had godly wisdom and was using godly wisdom to try to guide him through these experiments. And so, using the wisdom that he had, there was nothing, and it says here in a little bit, there's nothing that his eyes saw that he liked that he didn't get. He didn't limit himself to anything in trying to figure out what truly makes man happy. And so he experimented with wine. He experimented with folly. He experimented with just about everything you can come under the sun. But he kept coming to the exact same conclusion, which was like grasping the wind. It was vanity. There was no substance to it. He can't find the mechanism to connect the dots that makes men's journey through life real. Pleasure doesn't do it. Wine didn't do it. So he comes on a little bit farther. And it says that he made many things. I want to read to you 1 Kings 9, verses 15 through 19. And for those of you that kind of keep your hand out here, I'm not going to read 1 Kings 7, 1 to 12, but that's an exhaustive list of a lot of things that Solomon built in his time as king. And it talks about his houses and how long it took to build those houses and what he used to construct those houses. We won't go into all that, but that's a good read, 1 Kings 7, 1 through 12. But I want to read 9, 15 through 19. And if I got the 1 Kings, it'd be better. Here we go.
Things he was indulging in. It's always good to look at what their value. You mentioned their value, and their value is in the way that it's in balance. Mm-hmm. If we, like wine, for instance, if it's used in balance, then it's a good thing. And and folly, for instance. If it's balanced, then it's a good thing.
Yeah.
And it's a useful thing. And each one of those, and that's what he's going to discover.
Right, and he does. So we're talking about the balance between is something worthless or what kind of worth does it have. And he discovers that balance in verse 24, and we'll talk about that here in just a little bit. That's a good point. 1 Kings 9, 15 through 19. And under this little paragraph in my Bible, it says Solomon's additional achievements, right? He just talked about what all he's built and everything. And this is the reason for the labor force which King Solomon raised, to build the house of the Lord, his own house, the Millo, the wall of Jerusalem, Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Pharaoh the king of Egypt had gone up and taken Gezer and burned it with fire, had killed the Canaanites who dwelt in the city, and had given it as a dowry to his daughter, who was Solomon's wife. And Solomon built Gezer, Lower Beth Horon, Baalath, and Tadmor in the wilderness in the land of Judah. All the storage cities that Solomon had, cities for his chariots and cities for his cavalry, and whatever Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem and Lebanon and all in the land and all of his dominion. Okay, I wanted to read that to you because he's not only building buildings, he's building cities. Okay, think about that. He's got a labor force that he's acquired. We won't go into how he made his labor force, but he's got some slave labor that he's using, and he's using this labor to build massive cities, complete infrastructure for the whole region that he's over. It even goes in to talk about he builds vast water pools, and the only reason why he would build these vast water pools is he uses that water to water the fruit trees and stuff that he imports in from all over the world so he can have nice things to eat, right? I mean, it's a vast infrastructure. But I think that we're talking about how vast his wealth was and what he did with that wealth. So he built a lot of things, and then he says, such as servants. So whatever he wanted, he got, such as servants, livestock. We've talked before about the vast livestock that he had. Silver, gold, treasures, singers, and the delights of the sons of men, which may or may be those concubines that he had. Musical instruments. He had it all. And I think it's important to note that Solomon had so much gold that silver became worthless to him. Think about that. It's so much gold. And I'm going to read a couple of things here, and I'm just kind of listen to me. 1 Kings 9:28 says, and they went to Ophir and acquired 420 talents of gold from there and brought it to King Solomon. 1 Kings 10:10. Then she gave, this is the Queen of Sheba. Then she gave the king 120 talents of gold, spices in great quantity, and precious stones. There never again came such abundance of spices as the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. Verse 14, the weight of gold that came to Solomon yearly was 666 talents of gold. Verse 21, all of King Solomon's drinking vessels were gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Not one was silver, for this was accounted as nothing for the days of Solomon. There's 3 or 4 that I could keep on going. Covered in gold. What did he do with this wealth? And if you read in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, this is where it gets a little confusing. So I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. Verse 10, whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward from all my labor. He seemed to be happy, didn't he? Matter of fact, he wrote, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor. I built these things, I've acquired this money, I've acquired these materialistic things, and man, it makes me happy. So it leads us to think, okay, well, hold on. He may have found what he's looking for. Yes?
It goes to, most people seem to find Christ in the depths of their kingdom depravity or disparity. Robbie Zacharias up there heard me say, more people find themselves more depressed and the more depressed and so-called pleasure, but then being calamity. They find out the more they do it, it's like drinking salt water. They think it's going to quench their.
That's exactly what Solomon is finding out. He's amassed all these things. He's built all these things. He's built cities all over his kingdom. And all of a sudden he says, hey, my heart is rejoicing with all my labor. But then, yes?
Today's terminology is lifestyle of the rich and famous.
Yeah, there's a lot of shows on TV that are similar to this. But guess what he does? He says, my heart's rejoicing for this. But then he decides to use that God wisdom that he's been given to really look at a deep down. Why am I happy? Why am I rejoicing? Okay? And that's what now the next portion of Scripture goes to. So don't stop reading right there when it says, my heart's rejoicing. Because then all of a sudden, some people would say, oh, happiness is found in wealth. He won't stop, right? Because, and think about why he won't stop. He won't stop because God has given him an amount of wisdom that it always makes him dig a little deeper. Most of us would probably have stopped right there and said,
that all the things we gain in this world does not make us happy.
That's what he's getting at. That's what he's getting at. And yeah, and we're fixing to find that out too. So he digs a little deeper. He says, I think I'm feeling good, but I'm going to use this God-given wisdom and I'm going to continue my study. And he starts reflecting back on what he did. Because look at verse 11. We just finished reading verse 10. Now look at verse 11. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had done and on the labor that I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind, and there was no profit under the sun. Wait a minute. He just wrote that his heart was happy. And then he took that deeper dive and he comes back and says, it's worthless. It's worthless. And here's the thing. He got to where he hated life. He had it all. He's going through this process, right? I see nature. It's just repeating itself over and over again. I've tried it all. I've had wine. I've had folly. I've had wealth. I've built things. I've made nice things. I've surrounded myself with gold. What can I do to make myself truly happy? And it's getting to where he hates life because he can't find it. And so he says here in chapter 2, verse 12, 13, and 14, then I turned myself to consider wisdom and madness and folly. He's still doing his deep dive here. For what can the man do who succeeds the king? Only what he's already done. Then I saw the wisdom excels folly, as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I myself perceive that the same event happens to them all. All right, let's just put this all together. it comes real quick to him. He says, I amass all these things, and then I'm going to die. And I can't take all my fun with me. He says, matter of fact, what happens to all my fun? It's going to go to somebody who may be wise like me, but may be a fool. And I have no control on how they use all my assets. I have no control on where all my gold goes, where all of my fancy buildings, how they're used. And he says, I can't even control really who gets it. Could be wise man or it could be a foolish man. And at the end of the day, what's going to happen to that man? He's going to die. And then he goes in to say, wait a minute, I have worked my fingers to the bone. And it goes in to say, I've stayed up at night. I've wrestled in my sleep, worried about all these things that we're doing, building all this stuff. How am I going to get all these horses and chariots to where I need to get? And all of a sudden he says, I've worried myself to death to where it's really not even fun. And what am I doing? I'm setting up the next guy who didn't have to do any hard work for this. And he goes in to say, that's a great evil for me to set somebody up like that. Now, we see some of that today, don't we? Don't we see some people that have amassed massive fortunes? They don't ever seem to be happy. You know why? And that's a generality. I'm sure there's some, but the generality is they're never truly happy because they always want a little more. Right? Take the richest man in the world. I read an article about him the other day, Jeff Bezos, Amazon guy. You know why he can't sleep at night? Because he's thinking about the next deal. He's thinking about how he's going to get more. And then you talk about these people that acquire this vast wealth, what a lot of them do. They just want to give it all away. Right? They'll leave a small portion to their kids and their family, but they're not going to leave them $100 billion. You know why? Because what Solomon says is true. By and large, if you don't earn it and you get it, you're going to squander it. Not always true. It's generality. So there's some lessons that we see today. So he sees that and he starts getting upset. He's like, I don't have any control over my wealth and what's going to happen to it. So it talks about how grievous it was to him and how it was vanity and grasping for the wind. And so he really starts thinking hard about his wealth. And the next thing you know, he says, at the end, what does he have to show for all of his efforts besides sorrowful days, restless nights, and grievous work? Man, now here's the good thing. That's kind of a gloomy story, right? All of a sudden we're introduced. He starts figuring it out right here. And it shows up in verse 24. And let's back up maybe to verse 22, but we're getting to verse 24. Verse 22. For what has man for all of his labor and for the striving of his heart with which he has toiled under the sun? For all of his days are sorrowful and his work burdensome, even in the night as his heart takes no rest. This is also vanity. But verse 24. Nothing is better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. First time we just saw it. Okay? He says it's okay to have these things as long as you're able to sit back and enjoy the fruits of your things to benefit others. And he says that solely comes from God. Okay? We have all these things. How do we use them to benefit God? And then all of a sudden he's fixing to go into what the Christian ought to think as opposed to the sinner ought to think. Yes, ma'am.
And Jeff Bezos, and he just got divorced. So
Yeah.
his life is, anyway. But his wife, who got half of everything, took half of her billion and immediately spread it through charities
Right.
to help people. And yet he's still sitting there with what? You know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of, she was ready to, you can only have so much. You need to give, and he just
Yep.
wants to make more.
Right. Man should seek the joy that his labor brings. Look at, we just read verse 22. Also, the next, and we'll talk about it next week, chapter 3, verses 12 and 13. You're going to see something very similar here. It says, I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives, and also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all of his labor. It is the gift of God. So you're going to see that type of language happen now 6 more times throughout the rest of the book, because he's starting to figure it out. These things are a gift from God. Now, how do I use them? And that is the meaning of life. Helping people get from point A to point B. And point A meaning out of Christ. Point B meaning into Christ. Okay? A lot of times, and I wrote this in here for you, in verse 24, you'll hear the world quote this a little bit. Ecclesiastes 2, verse 24, but they won't quote the last sentence. Now, you've heard the last sentence, which is the gift of God. Now, what if we quoted this without the last sentence? Nothing is better for a man that he should eat and drink. Eat, drink, and be merry. Y'all have heard that before? Well, the only problem is they didn't read the rest of that verse. Right? I like what 1 Timothy 6:17 says. It's kind of a companion verse to this. 1 Timothy 6:17 says, command those who are rich in the present age not to be haughty, nor to trust in uncertain riches, but trust in the living God who gives us richly all things to enjoy. Everything comes from what? From God. And when Solomon starts getting out of his mindset that I did this and I did that and I want to control everything, when he moves that away to say, God has given me this gift, now how can I use this to enjoy these gifts, but use it to benefit people? All of a sudden the light has turned on. Okay? I wanted to go over this. The ability to enjoy one's life is a gift from God. Now, kind of follow me here. No one can truly enjoy life without God. Ecclesiastes 2:18 and 19 starts talking about that. But stay with me. To those good in His sight, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and joy. Look at verse 26, chapter 2, verse 26. For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in His sight. But to the sinner, He gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. That's getting pretty deep there now. I'll read it again. For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight. What does Hebrews tell us? Those who lack wisdom, ask for it, and God will give in abundance, more than you ask for. That's what happened to Solomon. That's what's been told will happen to us. For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight. But to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. I started looking. I said, I needed something else on that. And sure enough, Proverbs 28:8, about 2 pages to the left of where we are, Proverbs 28:8 has something to say about that same thing. One who increases his possessions by usury and extortion gathers it for him who will pity the poor. Those who make their fortune by bad means, Proverbs says, is actually gathering that fortune for those who will help the poor. Now, don't ask me any questions about that. That's pretty deep stuff. I don't know, but it's pretty interesting. Because what is Solomon said? I gather all this stuff, but I can't take it with me. And then the next thing you know is it's going to fall into somebody's hands who I don't know if they're good or bad. And they're going to die. And it's going to fall into somebody's hands. Eventually, that's going to fall into somebody's hands that's going to use it in a godly way to help those who are in need. And Solomon has found out, I want to be that guy. And that is the meaning of life. And now all of a sudden he's on to something, starting in verse 24, that goes down through 26. And then next week we're going to talk about chapter 3, and he's going to start developing this pathway for the rest of the book. But we have to be kind of careful, because in Solomon's writing, remember, this is not written in like the old prophetic mindset, which is, this is the law, this is how you broke the law, so this is your punishment, and this is when it's going to happen. This is written in wisdom themes, wisdom literature, which is like, we're going to take a topic and we're going to exhaust it, and at the end of the day, we're going to make a conclusion on what makes us to be more wise and why we're here. So it's not a linear conversation that we're going to have for the rest of the book. It kind of goes like this. So remember, always when we're reading Ecclesiastes, you have to read it through Solomon's mind, because he's dragging us a little bit through a keyhole to get the answer. He's not just coming out and telling us. Because he wants us to do what? He wants us to think about our life. When we read these pages, he wants to think about us, where we live, what time we live in, what kind of assets we have, how are we managing those assets, what kind of wisdom do I have? Do I have enough? Am I asking enough? Am I praying enough? Or am I just wandering through life because I think my heart is happy? Not an easy book to read when you think about it like that. Yes, sir. Ma'am? It does fit us. I mean, if you think about it, who's the richest people to ever have lived? It's us. I thought about it the other day. I went and bought a hamburger and French fries. It was $8 and something. And I was like, that's probably because I got a big fry and all that. I kind of did some other stuff to it. But, you get in and I thought to myself, you get used to paying $8 for that. And then I thought about $8 is a month's wages for some people. Yes, sir.
One modern day practical application. And I'm going to speak from the perspective of the man. Think about how many times during our lifetime when we needed a tool. And we thought that tool is going to solve my problems. And we saved and rationalized how we're going to buy it. And then 15 years later, you accidentally find that tool and you never use it.
Yeah. Yeah.
We will leave the lesson at that. Now, I would love to be able to use, I have a lot of tools. A lot of tools. I just don't know how to use any of them. And Kimberly says, put that up and let me call somebody. Thank y'all for coming. Chapter